Hello, Peter Carson here. Welcome to our part 1 of 2 webinar on employee self-service forms and workflows. Just advance our slides here. There we go. My name, as I mentioned, Peter Carson, President of Extranet User Manager and Envision IT, also an Apps and Services Microsoft MVP. Contact details are in here. We're going to be sharing the deck up on our event page, and we'll send out a link afterwards with the recording and link to the deck that everybody can follow up from there. Also on the line with me here today, I've got Logan Guest, who's in charge of sales. So if you want to reach out about anything you've seen here in terms of engaging us and moving forward, absolutely, there's lots of ideas you can run with on your own here, but feel free to reach out to Logan if you're interested from that point of view. I want to start with a quick poll just to get a sense of the audience and who's got experience with which in here. We're actually not going to get into the technical details in today's session. We're going to focus on the business side of it, but it's still important for me to understand who uses which technologies before we get into the session itself. So if you could just respond, are you using Office 365 today? Do you have any experience with Power Automate or Flow? How about PowerApps and Azure Logic Apps? If you're not sure what those are, don't worry, just answer as appropriate as you know through there. Let me give a second for the last few people to respond in there. Let me close that out now. All right, so let me share that poll out just so everybody can see what comes back from that. So absolutely everybody using Office 365. That's great to see. Cloud is making a ton of sense, particularly these days with COVID and everything that's going on, people working remotely. Having access to all your data in the cloud just makes perfect sense. About half the group experience with Power Automate or Flow, about a third with PowerApps, less so from a Logic Apps point of view. And for those that aren't familiar with the Logic Apps, we'll touch on them briefly. They are actually the underlying technology underneath Power Automate. Let me hide that and just continue with the deck that we've got going here. So just from a quick agenda point of view, not a lot of agenda points. We're going to do a little bit of background and then dive right into customer scenarios. And that's really our focus for today. Now, this is a new session for me. I haven't delivered this one before. So, we may end up shorter than the 45 minutes we've got scheduled in there. We'll see how it goes through there. Now, if you have questions that you're going through, the questions is open. I'm not going to be having a look as I'm presenting, but Logan and others on the staff side who are online can respond to that. If we need to, we can always follow up afterwards to answer your questions. So let's start just some examples from an employee self-service point of view. What sort of things would make sense from this perspective? And one of the big ones is onboarding. As you bring new staff into your organization, there's typically a lot of paperwork involved in that, and how does that work for your organization? But not just onboarding, but if there's a change in role, if you get a new position, what needs to happen from that point of view? And unfortunately, there's offboarding scenarios as well. There may be employee personal data, expense reports, leave requests, benefits, your pension, if you have a company pension, having a calculator as part of that is something we've done before, access to your tax slips, to online training, performance management from a review point of view, time tracking, wellness surveys, P-card requests is one of the ones we're going to be looking at. So if you have a purchasing card, how do you request one? How do you request limit changes to that? Petty cash, shift changes. This is just a sampling that I kind of made up off the top of my mind and doing a little bit of Googling and getting ideas from that point of view. Obviously, there's a lot of different opportunities from that perspective. And one of the things I found when I was doing my Googling to prep for the session is this ADP survey that was done last year in 2019. And it asked a number of questions of employees themselves, of managers, and of HR in terms of how does their organization do onboarding? Do they do it extremely well or not so much? And from a manager's point of view, only 9% of managers said, yes, we do it extremely well. HR administrators, 19%, employees, 25%. So obviously different perceptions within the organization, but the overwhelming one is, for the most part, nobody does it really well. And, more than half of the HR administrators felt that their onboarding solutions are only somewhat structured or not at all structured. So obviously a lot of room for improvement from that point of view. Next stat, from an employee satisfaction point of view, only 21% of employees were extremely satisfied with the organization's onboarding process. And that's an important metric. You think about, your first day at a new job at a new organization, that tone is going to hold with you, and having a great onboarding experience is going to be a positive lead-in for your role within that organization. Having a terrible one obviously is going to have an opposite effect from that point of view. And that last stat on the lower right there, the fact that employees highly satisfied with their onboarding, 3 times as likely to feel comfortable after their first day, and twice as likely to feel comfortable later on in their first year. So, I mean, this is a really important metric. And on the left-hand side, another interesting one there, 80% of HR administrators say that paperwork is still completed in person, either at a desk or in a conference room. That they're still using paper and pen to do their onboarding process, and that less than 12% of employees could actually access not only onboarding as a whole, but any single piece of the onboarding paperwork from their mobile device. And that's a sobering one. It is a mobile first workforce out there, particularly these days with everybody working remotely. The ability to do that on your mobile device is clearly lacking in most organizations, and that's a big gap from that point of view. So that's really our focus here today is how do we make it easy to build some of those processes, not just from an onboarding point of view, but that whole set of items that I threw out there from an employee self-service point of view. So I'm going to start with a customer scenario, and if you've tuned into previous webinars, this is actually one that I went through on a workflow, Microsoft Flow and Logic Apps session that I did back in February. And I'm not going to go too deep on it, I'm just going to give you a high-level sense on it. And basically it was a finance help system. So there's a number of different scenarios around P-card requests and changes, petty cash requests that need to be filled out and tracked through a workflow. And there's some employee data that comes from PeopleSoft, from their Active Directory, that they need to make part of this process. And then there's a 2-stage approval workflow where when somebody fills this out, it needs to go to their manager, and then it needs to go to finance from there. And there's some intricacies in those workflows around the amount of the request, and is it above or below a manager's approval level, and such that become part of that workflow as well. And then a reporting dashboard to be able to see state of things as a whole and what that looks like. So basically the process is an employee fills out that finance request form. It triggers a Flow workflow, and I'll talk more about Flow in a minute. It goes to their manager for approval, then it goes to finance, and then a notification goes back to the employee letting them know the status from that. So it's a pretty straightforward workflow from that perspective. And the app itself, which I had a screenshot there in the previous screen, is built in a tool called PowerApps. And for those of you not familiar with PowerApps, it's basically an app development platform, part of Office 365 for building apps for mobile, desktop, or responsive web applications. So the nice thing is that there's a huge set of connectors available, so you can extend it into lots of different systems from that point of view. It does get to licensing implications, and I won't get into the licensing details here. If you're interested in that, check out the February webinar that I did. I went much deeper from that point of view. And there's also a link here to the PowerApps site if you want to get more detail from that perspective. And typically with any form, there's a workflow behind it. So in the Community Living Toronto example, we're routing it to their manager and to the finance department. Power Automate, which used to be called Flow, is the tool that we use to build that. So it's a great way to create automated workflows, and it's not just about working in the Microsoft world. Again, you can connect to third-party apps. You can build your own custom connectors if you need to, if you've got your own systems that you want to get integrated in as part of that. Again, different licensing implications there. More details in the previous webinar on that side. What I want to do now, though, is go a little deeper into our second scenario. And this is actually a leave request form that we're building for here at Envision IT. And it's replacing a legacy one that we built, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago. And it's one that we built for ourselves and for a number of our clients. And it was a fairly complex solution. It had an HTML web form that we created that people would fill in, and there was a back-end API that handled a bunch of the logic, and there was workflows around that. It was built pre any of these power tools from Microsoft. So there was no forms, there was no Power Automate or Flow, any of that side of things. So it did require a fair bit of development effort to build that in. Now we've gone through a modernization exercise on our Office 365. We're getting rid of all our old and moving it all to modern and simplifying as we do that. This was one of the things that we identified as part of that. We said, let's keep this really, really simple. We want a very basic form. Doesn't even need to present any sort of background data. The previous form would show you all of your previous requests and how many days you had left in your allocation. And I'll show you in a minute how we address that, but we don't feel that we need to put that on the form itself. Let's just make it a simple 5-question form that fills in, what type of request are you doing? What's your start and end dates? How many days does that encompass? In fact, we're not even going to auto-calculate the total business days. We didn't want to get into tracking staff holidays and figuring out the calendar details around that. Just employees know if they're taking, a Christmas holiday vacation that encompasses a couple of stats, account for it in there, calculate it appropriately, and submit it. I mean, it could get extended and get more sophisticated, but again, we wanted to keep with that theme of keeping it really simple from that point of view. So what we end up with is a Microsoft form that people can fill in. So let me switch over and show you what that actually looks like. So this is still a work in progress. We have our follow-on part 2 webinar coming in 2 weeks' time. So we don't have all the technical bits wired together on it, but we've got enough here to give you a sense of what this is going to look like. So this is sort of the home page as an employee of their leave request area. So it shows us here, what's my current allocation of how many vacation days have I accrued for this year, how many days are already approved, so either past or future requests that have already gone through from an approval point of view, and how many days remaining do I have. I just realized I did a typo in there, so got to tweak that. And we've got a couple of list views here that show me, what are my pending requests that I'm waiting for approval, any upcoming requests. I've got a request here for Easter Monday coming up on this Monday, and historical requests. I did a week out at Revelstoke back in February, awesome time when we could still travel, and that's there from a historical point of view. But if I want to start a new request, I've got this option here to submit a new leave request. So let me just launch that off into a new tab and show you what that looks like. So as I mentioned, it's a very simple form. I pick from a drop down here, hey, I want to do a vacation. I want to pick it for Monday the 13th, just that day. It's one business day, and I want to take Easter Monday off. Go ahead and submit that, and that submits into a workflow and ultimately into the list from there and drives through that process. That piece we don't have running just yet, but we've got a good start on it. We'll have something great to show you in our part 2 of the webinar. But let me show you a bit under the hood as to how that form is actually built. So if I go to forms.office.com, and you don't actually need an Office 365 subscription to use Microsoft Forms. I've got the Forms Pro tool. It adds a couple features. Honestly, we're not leveraging any of this, so you could use the free Forms tool to do that. And actually, Kate, who's been working on this form, has actually created that and then shared it with me. So you can work collaboratively on building the forms out. If I open that up, it's very, very simple. If I want to change the title on it, I just click in and edit. And away you go. There's not even a save button. It just auto saves as I'm working through there. I've got my list of choices here in terms of what I wanted here, and we sorted this in what makes sense. That's put the common requests up at the top and the less common down below. My start date, my end date, and it's very simple. As I add new questions in here, if I say add new, what type of question do I want? Is it a choice like we saw up at the top with the request type? Is it a text box for me to fill in? A rating, a date. There's a number of other different ones there, a ranking, sections and such from there. So you can start to build out your form. Now we haven't used any of the branching logic in here where you can say, if somebody answers this question in this way, we want to drive other questions or other branches in there. So you can start to add a little bit of sophistication to your forms through there. But the idea is it's really quick and dirty to create a form. And even if you're not building a full-fledged employee self-service form, if you need to get a quick survey up, you want to get some feedback from staff, given that everybody's now dispersed and work remotely, strongly encourage you, if you haven't checked out Microsoft Forms, have a look at it. It's a great way to collect feedback from that point of view. Now we're integrating it into a workflow, but you can literally spin up a form and just have it saved back into Microsoft Forms. It'll do a nice job of building some reports and some charts for you, so you can analyze and use that data. You can export it out to Excel, do things from that. So it's a very low touch, easy to use tool. You don't need to be a developer. You don't even need to be a power user per se to use that. Try it out and see where you go from there. Now what we've done is we've shared this form out and we've set it so that only people in the organization can respond. So this link here requires you to be signed in as an Envision IT staff member to be able to access the form, which we want in this scenario. But you can also share it out anonymously to say, hey, I want to make it available to anybody to use, and away they go from there. So that's kind of the back side of it. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into the flow side of it, but I'll show you just quickly here. We have the leave request workflow, and this is what we're going to be covering in part 2 of the scenario. Basically, every workflow starts with what's called a trigger. It says, hey, in this case, when somebody submits that leave request form for Microsoft Forms, you can see there's a built-in connector for forms in here. Do a bunch of stuff. Get some variables together, go through those responses, basically collect all that data, and then ultimately down here, start an approval process. And right now this is hard-coded in, but we'll get some logic in there to determine who should get that request. And the way that we determine that, we've built a simple but still fairly elegant solution to track all that. What we do is we have this employee data folder set here. And what this does is it keeps data about each employee in the organization. So if I go into, say, Anish is one of our developers, first off, security is really important. We want to make sure that only the right people get to see the information that's in here. So each of these applications that we build, like the leave request, we're going to talk about expenses in a minute, has their own library. Every staff member has a folder within that library. We can see here that only certain people have access to it. So Anish obviously needs access to his own stuff. From an org chart point of view, Anish reports to Dinesh, who's the director of development. Dinesh reports to me, so we all have access, and then Deb runs our HR, so she needs access to everybody from an HR approvals point of view. As we look through different people, if I come down to Dinesh's, for example, instead of Anish's, we see only 3 people have access there because Dinesh just has one report above into me, and Deb still has HR access from that point of view. So it's important when you're building these kinds of solutions to make sure that you've got security taken care of part of that. So thinking back to leave request points to consider, things that we want to think about. We had some town hall discussions with staff yesterday, actually, to get their feedback on this solution because we haven't rolled it out to them yet. And obviously Deb had a lot of good points from an HR point of view, but staff as a whole as well. Some way to track the vacation days allocated, accrued, and already taken. And that's what we've incorporated into the top of the home page here. We're going to actually display that based on the requests that have been approved and the allocation that you have available to you. From a security point of view, it's important not just to hide other people's information, but actually secure it, to make sure that no matter whether it's somebody casually looking or somebody aggressively trying to see in there information that they shouldn't see, that we've got the property secured in place and they're not able to see anything other than their own requests or any of their direct or indirect reports. And I should have one more bullet, finance or HR is appropriate from a line of business point of view. And now, as a manager is approving, one of the common things is, well, how many days do they have available, and then are they allowed to take these days off? But also, what other staff are taking vacation as part of this. So if we come back to our self-service portal here, we have the ability, since this is a SharePoint, we can create different lists and different views very easily through here. In fact, I didn't get into the technical part, but these, pending, upcoming, historical requests, these are all just views that I created through SharePoint. So I didn't need to write code for this. Once I've got the data in SharePoint, I can create filters and views to say, hey, only show me ones whose date is in the future or whose date is in the past, one that's assigned to me, one whose status is approved or still pending. And that's basically how we build out all these different views through here. Now, we also want to have a general vacation calendar view that'll show all the vacations. So we can see here, I guess Kate was doing some testing, so we've got a test one in there. We've got my vacation for this coming Monday, and Dinesh's that we saw in there is a pending one as well. So a very easy way to see all of the staff requests. Now, right now, this is going against those private views, so people only see what they're allowed to see from that perspective. But part of the plan for the workflow is, well, let's publish this to a different calendar once they're all approved, so everybody in the organization can see when people have time off and booked. It's great to know, hey, I haven't seen Dinesh online. He hasn't turned green in Teams yet. Oh, wait, he's got Monday booked off as a vacation day. I shouldn't expect to see him through there. So providing that visibility throughout the organization, you can decide for your organization. We're a company of 17 people. It makes sense to be very transparent from that point of view. You may want to restrict that back to a certain degree, and you can decide how much of the request information you want to share out from that point of view. Maybe you don't want to put upcoming sick leaves, if there's planned surgeries and things like that people maybe don't want to share from a calendar point of view. You decide how visible you want to be from that perspective. And because it's a separate calendar, the workflow can actually take care of that. If we come back to the self-service side of things here, So we talked about the allocations, the ability to submit a new request, the different views here. Now this is my view, so it's showing any pending requests that I have that aren't approved, and my upcoming and my historical. What we did was created a manager dashboard here as well that basically does the same thing, but it shows slightly different views. It shows that, hey, Kate put a test in here. Dinesh has his Monday vacation submitted, but I haven't approved it yet. We've got an upcoming request which is already approved, that's ready to go, and some historical requests here. So a manager would be able to see, what's my pending queue that's assigned to me in terms of waiting for my approval, and go forward from there. Now, in terms of how those approvals work, I don't have the email part of the approval together just yet, but the idea is there that we use approvals in Flow, and it sends you a nicely formatted email that gives you all the detail that you need as a manager to decide whether you want to approve this in terms of how many days this person has allocated remaining, what's this request for, when is it for, and such. That all comes in the body of the email. And then right in the email itself, there's an approve, reject, and a comments box. So I don't even need to go over to the portal, to the manager dashboard. I can do all that right in my Outlook in my email, either approve or reject it, and away it goes from there. And the same thing happens from a second level approval, where in this case it would be going to HR. They can do that same approval from that perspective. So some of the other things to consider, changes obviously need to happen through here. So one of the key things to remember, if we're using Microsoft Forms for this, Forms is very much from an initial submission point of view. So if I'm on this form here, I can submit a new request, but I can't go back and edit that request later. Forms doesn't let me pull up the previous request, change it, and resubmit it. And in some employee self-service scenarios, that's a problem. We're going to talk about expense forms in a minute. Those can get quite complex. You've got a lot of different items on there, and it's not an uncommon scenario for you to submit your expense form and then realize, oh, darn, I forgot one receipt. I need to go back in. It hasn't been finance approved yet, so I can resubmit it, restart the approval process. So you want to be able to edit that style form. But we made a decision with the leave request form. We want to keep it simple. And what that means is if somebody's submitted and they need to change it, just cancel your previous request. So you would do that on the dashboard here. We would have the ability to say, hey, I want to cancel a pending or an upcoming request and just submit a new one. I mean, it is literally just 5 questions for you to fill out. It's not difficult for you to do that. Go ahead and recreate it and start that approval process again from there. And then lastly for us, I mean, we are a consulting firm, so keeping track of everybody's time from a billing point of view is very important. We want to make sure that when somebody's got a sick day or a personal day or vacation day, that gets tracked properly from a time tracking point of view. One of the things Deb does from a kind of a combination of HR and finance, because she wears both of those hats in our organization, is reconciling that to say, okay, if somebody said they had 3 vacation days booked from a vacation request point of view and those are approved and taken, did they put the 3 days in from a time tracking point of view? Let's make sure that that's properly reconciled from that perspective. So we talked about building some integrations between those. That's something we may consider in the future. But again, with the keep it simple approach, we thought, let's just do a manual reconciliation from that point of view. Because this is our org structure, it's pretty flat, as I mentioned. I mean, the left-hand side of the staff all report up into me, so I've got sort of 3, 7, 8 direct reports. Dinesh has about the same on the technical side. So we kind of divide the team that way, and then Dinesh reports up to me. So it's not like we've got a deep hierarchy from that point of view. Obviously, as the organization grows, that gets deeper. But the concept is that we've kept that very simple in terms of the structure under here and how we apply the security. Basically, every employee gets a folder, and then whoever up that reporting chain needs access gets access through the security. And once we set that up once, we don't need to worry about that every time somebody submits a form or goes to approve a form. It all hangs together quite nicely from that point of view. So this is quite scalable into larger organizations. It would need some tweaking if you were into thousands or tens of thousands of employees. At that point, you'd likely have an HRIS system that deals with a lot of this stuff. Really, the target for what we're talking about here is organizations that maybe don't have a self-service portal on their HRIS and want to attach something to that. And that typically is more in the tens or hundreds of employees type of scenario. Some into the low thousands we've done. So I've talked about Microsoft Forms. I got a little page in here just so if you want to come back and have a look at it yourself later, forms.office.com is the link that you want to have there. like I showed you, it's very straightforward to build the forms out, and it integrates quite nicely through Power Automate into SharePoint from that point of view. You can share it with staff. You can even share it externally. If you want to do customer-facing or anonymous type surveys and such, Forms is a great way to do that too. And we've already gone through the actual workflow of what happens for that in terms of the employee filling out that leave request in the Microsoft form. That's what triggers the workflow that sends it to the manager for approval and up to HR after that from an approval point of view, recorded in their employee file, posted over to that shared staff vacation calendar so everybody can see it, and then notify the employee, let them know, hey, you're good to go. Everything's approved from that point of view. Now, one of the things to remember here, this idea of manager approval. I'm going to get techie for a second here. Apologies. Let's go into Anisha's employee data here. And what we do on a nightly basis is we have a job that runs that gathers the employee data. In our scenario, we're just pulling it all from Active Directory. You may have an HRIS system, like in the Community Living Toronto example, they have PeopleSoft as an HRIS, but they don't have employee self-serve, which is why we're building forms for them. But basically, you draw that data from whatever source makes sense and fill out this employee data file. Now, it's a technical file. It's not intended to be used by an end user. It's intended for the workflows to be able to use this. So when Anish fills out a request, it's looking at this hierarchy structure to say, okay, who is Anish's manager? Well, that's Dinesh. I need to make Dinesh the approver on Anisha's leave request and send him the email through that process. And maybe if Dinesh doesn't respond in a certain period of time, that needs to escalate to me, and I can basically act as a delegate and approve on Dinesh's behalf because I am an indirect supervisor of Anish from it. And some other details, what's Anish's employee number, what department does he work for, what's his job title, and we're pulling all that from Active Directory. One of the key ones, though, is this hierarchy, and that's actually a property in Active Directory called Manager. And it's an important key. It actually drives a lot of things in Office 365. If you go to Anisha's Delve page that shows his hierarchy. Actually, let me show this just for a second here. See if this works on the fly. I actually hadn't planned this part of the demo out. So if I come over to Delve, which is part of the Office 365 services, basically a way to discover profile information and activity of what people are working on. So if I search for Anish here and pull up his Delve page, we actually see his reporting structure in here, that Anish works for Dinesh, and Dinesh reports up into me. That's all driven from the manager field in Active Directory getting properly filled out. It's really important organizationally that you do a good job of populating Active Directory and filling that in, not only so that pages like this Delve page works properly, but so that we can figure out this proper hierarchy and have the approval workflows work properly from that point. So it all kind of hangs together based on having good employee data in your Active Directory, and then everything feeds up from there. All right, let's come back to the deck. So our next scenario, I mentioned previously, we're going to talk about an expense report. Now this one's a little different because, as we discussed, we need the ability to be able to not only initially fill this in, but it be able to come back later and edit it. And there's also some complexity on this form. If we look at the mock-up here, and I'll show you the real one in a minute, I have the ability to hit a plus sign here and just keep adding more rows to this expenses table because I don't know how many different expenses somebody's going to submit, because this form gets submitted on a monthly basis for us. Likewise, we don't know how many client trips. Obviously, a lot less of that going on, pretty much zero. But at some point we'll return to normal from that point of view, and we'll want to be able to track that mileage and auto-calculate based on the number of kilometers. We've got a standard 55 cents per kilometer that we pay from a mileage point of view and calculate out the totals. We can't do that kind of complexity with a Microsoft form. It just doesn't let us build that style form. Now, we could use PowerApps to do this. Honestly, we've built some of these things with PowerApps, and it actually gets pretty convoluted trying to do these repeating tables and getting these form interactions in there. I'm not actually that big of a fan of it, so we've kind of stepped away from that. For this one, we decided, let's build it as an HTML web form. And yes, that means that you need to have a developer build that. It's no longer a power user building that form. And the reality was we tried with some of our clients having power users build PowerApps forms, and it just doesn't work. It's too complex. Microsoft kind of recognized that, and even though there's the word power in the name of the product, they're now saying the target audience for that is a citizen developer. So you do need to have sort of developer shops. And we thought, you know what, if you're going to do that, why don't we just go to a web form where we have complete control over it, and we can build a much more interactive form through there. Now, of course, I didn't have a link to that form, so I'm going to bear with me for a second while we see if I can pull that up from my browser history. I do have it. Okay. Okay. This is actually just an HTML mock-up of the form itself. So it's a self-contained form. It has some JavaScript and jQuery behind it. We're not going to get into the technical bits of it right now, but the idea is somebody just basically the date that they're expense sensing for. Let's say I'm doing my March expenses. Now, right now, it's got a field for me to fill in my name. That wouldn't actually get filled in manually. It would get auto-filled based on who signed in and filling out the form. And then I basically go through and start putting my expenses in. Say, okay, on March 29th, I did ABC, and what category of expense was that? That was some meals with the clients, and I spent $50 on that. And you can see as we go through, totals will update and such from there. And I just realized I didn't refresh this with the current version of the form. Oh well, we'll come back to that. What I should see is a plus sign in there to be able to add new rows and build out the mileage and such from there as well. Get the totals, put in any notes that I need, and go ahead and submit that form. Now, from this point forward, the process is actually very similar to the leave request form that we just saw. We're going to have a workflow behind that receives that request, updates things, puts them into the employee folders, and starts that approval process. So we keep going through here, things to consider from this point of view. We do have need to have the ability to modify this after submitting. So right now, if we look back at these lists that we have here from a leave request point of view, I don't have any of the expense forms rendered in the same sort of way, but I don't have the ability to just click on this and launch Microsoft Forms and edit this. What we will have with the expense form is that ability that I can literally click on it, launch it out, and modify it from there. Now, obviously, if it gets to the point that it's been finance approved and it's been paid out, we don't want any modifications happening on that. So the workflow can set the status on that and either allow or disallow that link to appear for people to be able to submit updates onto that. Now, one of the things that we have, we literally have an info path form as our expense report right now today that we've just discontinued and we're replacing with this one here. But the way that one worked is people would fill the form out electronically, but then they would literally print it out, staple their receipts to it, and that would get handed around from a paper signature point of view. We obviously want to get away from that. So what we want to have happen is this expense form here have the ability to actually upload and attach receipts to that. And List and SharePoint are very good for that. When we write that to a SharePoint list, we can actually attach those documents, PDF scans, for example, right onto that list item. Now, one of the things that came up when we did our staff roundtable discussion was, wouldn't it be cool if we just PDF that entire report that had been submitted, including all the receipts, from an approval and retention point of view, so that 5 years down the road, if we need, we're getting an HST audit from CRA and we need to prove those expenses and what got spent from a tax point of view, that we've got all those receipts there, we can easily pull them out from the library. Even if we're no longer using this particular solution, the fact that we've turned them into PDFs make them very easy to retain and manage from that point of view. And we use CalPay from a payroll point of view. In the past, we've done hand paper checks for expenses. Again, we're going electronic on everything from that point of view. So the ability to pull down an Excel file of the monthly expense reports from everybody that have been approved, and then import that into CalPay to say, hey, let's just submit that for payment. Deb would prepare that. I sign off on it from an approval point of view, and that goes directly into people's accounts from an electronic payment point of view. It's a much simpler solution from that perspective. So the workflow, it looks very similar to the leave request one. The employee fills out the expense report. They're not filling in a Microsoft form. They're filling in a web form, but to them, that's no different. It's going to trigger our workflow, go to their manager, go to finance from a payment and approval point of view, get recorded in their employee file, notify them to let them know, hey, it's all approved. You should see the payment going through. And that's driven from that export going to CalPay from a payment perspective. So that's the examples. We're going to get much deeper under the hood in terms of what this looks like and how you build these in our follow-on webinar in 2 weeks' time. but I want to hold the technical bits for that. I do want to touch a little bit. I mentioned Azure Logic Apps at the beginning, and I explained it's the platform underneath Flows and Power Automate. So it uses the same designer. There are different actions in there. It is more of a technical tool. It lives within the Azure portal, so it's less of an end user tool. The difference is from a licensing point of view, this can be much more attractive from a licensing cost. It's licensed on a consumption basis, literally, in terms of millions of a cent, a dollar per action that gets executed in there. So the dollars can be quite small from that point of view. If you use Flow for some scenarios, that can add up into hundreds or thousands of dollars a month in terms of costs from that perspective. So you get a balance out which is easier to use and what's the operating costs from that perspective. And as I mentioned, I get much deeper into that. If you're curious, just go back to my February webinar that compared Power Automate and Logic Apps. I'm going to explain how that hangs together. And I go fairly quickly through these last ones. These are less from an employee self-service point of view, but I wanted to just bring up some past scenarios from the February webinar, just food for thought, that what I'm talking about here doesn't have to be just employee facing. It can involve external, it can involve other systems as part of that as well. This particular one, client of ours is a consulting company, much like ourselves. They provide consulting services to their clients. And obviously Teams is taking off in the workplace these days. Microsoft adoption of that is just going through the roof. We actually have an open source solution linked there on how to provide some governance and structure around that, around provisioning. And this particular solution goes a little further beyond the GitHub one that we put out there in terms of integrating that in with their Salesforce sales process. So quick workflow diagram here to show you what this looks like. In their case, they're using Salesforce. We use Microsoft Dynamics ourselves. We could do the same sort of thing with Dynamics. But basically, when a new opportunity is entered in the CRM system, that triggers a workflow. And it basically goes through and makes some decisions around, is there an existing team for that client in Microsoft Teams or not? And creates folders where the documents can go for that particular sales opportunity and update that back into CRM so people know where they're supposed to keep that. And then when that opportunity actually closes, in this scenario, if there isn't actually a team set up in Microsoft Teams for that client, you actually want to create that team. So create the Office 365 group, create the team, the SharePoint site, set up the structure of that so all the tabs and folders and everything's configured properly the way the client wants it from that point of view. Create all the project folders, and then move those sales documents into that project folder now that that client team exists, and update everything back into CRM, again, so that you know where all those documents live and reside going forward from there. So a little different scenario, but gives you a taste of some of the interesting things that you can do from a workflow point of view. And the last one here is actually for a manufacturing, high engineering touch organization, global organization, where they are managing their sales orders through SAP. And when things go to the shop floor, prior to that, there's a number of 2D and 3D drawings that need to be created of what they're actually going to be building and shipping to that particular client. So they wanted a workflow to manage that process. I need to create a friendlier view of this diagram here. It's a little confusing. It's a technical one. I need to create more of a marketing view of it. But basically what this is explaining for us is that, hey, we've got a sales order that came in from the system. We need to understand, does that customer already exist in our Office 365 portal? If not, create the folders and everything they need from that point of view. And they're actually using our Extranet User Manager product to invite the customers in to be able to review and approve these engineering drawings. So it creates the document set, uploads all the folders in there, figures out if a technical support engineer needs to approve before it goes to the customer, gets that approval in the workflow, and then if the customer approval is required, basically go through that approval process. And the links that go out to the customer actually drive them into that customer portal in Office 365, and they use our Extranet User Manager product to invite those customers in so they can actually see those documents in their portal, go through that approval, notify when everything's done, and then ultimately update SAP when they're finished through there. So you can build quite sophisticated workflows as part of this. This one was built using Logic Apps, hangs together quite nicely from that point of view. So that's it for my session. I wanted to get a quick sense from people that have been on the call here, just next steps from here. What are your interests? So let me just open this poll up for you. So basically, 1, 2, or 3 of these options, go ahead and check whichever are appropriate. As I mentioned, I've got the technical session coming up in 2 weeks' time. Are you planning on attending that? If you're non-technical, that may go too deep. You might have somebody else in your organization that makes more sense to come in for that. If you'd like a one-on-one conversation with me, happy to dive into your scenarios and see what that looks like. I'm also curious. We haven't officially open sourced any of this out like we've done with our teams provisioning stuff. There's not actually a ton of code there. I think there's a lot of value in putting that out in GitHub. So I just want to get an interest to see, hey, do people want to get their hands on the technical bits? What would that look like? So I'll give you a few more seconds there to respond. Very good. So it looks like everybody's interested in attending the technical session coming in. So stay tuned on that. That's 2 weeks from now. About half the people want to get their hands on the technical bit. So prior to that technical session, let me see about getting that published out so that people can get their hands on it and start playing around with that. So in terms of upcoming events, actually doing a couple of sessions at the Modern Workplace Summit. That was supposed to be in Philadelphia. It's now a virtual conference. We're on the Friday, I'm going to be delivering topics on external sharing in Office 365 and also the Teams provisioning that I described in one of the scenarios there. So feel free to tune into that, even though it's a US session. They don't celebrate Good Friday as a statutory holiday down there, but if you're interested, by all means tune in. And then, as I mentioned, on April 21st is the second part of this webinar, the Forms and Workflows deep technical dive. And then also the week following that, we've got John White, who's a fellow MVP, coming in to do a guest webinar talking about getting insights on your Office 365 and Microsoft 365 usage. So go to our eum.co/events site. You can see links for all that, the ability to register through there. So from there, I want to say thank you. Logan or anybody else, are there any questions that I should address before we sign off here? Awesome. Well, I'll give everybody a few minutes back. I want to thank you for joining today and talk soon in 2 weeks' time.